Here's another example. This is the Ponte Sisto. Again, the elevation of the bridge and a section through the bed of the Tiber. So this becomes very important. And these lines that demonstrate the level of various floods. That's 1742. So it was more or less the level of the 2008 flood that I showed you, the contemporary photographs. So these drawings are really well known. They've been pretty well published. The maps have been published and are well known. But what is not particularly well known are a number of drawings that are also part of this map. And they are a series of independent profile drawings of the riverbed along its urban course. So we don't have elevations of bridges. All we have is this section, a profile section, through the bed of the Tiber River. Now this one is pretty straightforward. If the whole river looked like this, there'd not be too much to worry about. We have this section is, there's the Farnesina over here. And we see they're using the opportunity. Here's the bed of the height of the water while they're doing their study, and then in relationship to various floods. And what you see is, here's the bed of the river, and we see greater deposits of sand and alluvium on this side. So it would mean that your dredging team would have a clue about where to go, where they would need to do greater dredging. It would be easier to figure out. Okay. Now these quite unassuming drawings, which is why they tend to be overlooked, are filled with information about the Tiber River that is not immediately evident from the surface of the river. And it's here that we most clearly see Chiesa and Gambarini's contribution to cartography and to Roman studies. Oh, I'm sorry, here's their section in the city. Am I going? Yeah, so within the city. And I'll just point out there are points where they call out the section N and section P, Q, R. These are the published sections. It's not clear how many other sections there might have been that weren't published. And here's just a group of them brought together to show you. And these are scattered all over the map. And I'm showing you the 1742 flood in relationship to these sections. And I should point out they've actually been narrowed. So in this case, the bed of the river is actually shown much narrower. Hydraulic studies of open channel dynamics, that is, of rivers and streams, had engaged architects and engineers long before Leonardo's experiments and insights in the 15th century, which I show you here. Yet the study of fluid motion still provided challenges well into the 18th century. And it was at that moment in the 18th century, in the mid-century, that Daniel Bernoulli and Leonard Euler established a formula that actually explains the forces acting on moving water. So we finally had an equation to define how much water is flowing through either a river or a conduit. So these experiments and formulas that had been taking place by others allowed Chiesa and Gambarini to study the river scientifically. And it meant they could more accurately calculate its flow. Remember, they're doing velocity studies that had been possible in any previous investigation. At the same time, the new hydraulic studies were taking place. Geographical mapping was increasingly seen as, quote, a fruitful discipline of mathematical cosmography that stood at the intersection between maps and scientific inquiry. Also, cartography was regarded as a tool that provided accurate spatial information to civil and military authorities. Accuracy in mapping was expanding to larger scale projects, as we've seen with the Noli plan, for example. But now it was going from whole cities to entire countries in the 18th century. By the end of the 18th century, a map of France, for example, had been made, a topographic map. A perhaps unexpected byproduct of this process of large-scale mapping, and this is just a thought, is that it marks what I think could be an important stage in the conceptualization of ecosystems and the formation of a science of ecology, in that it allowed surveyors and their patrons and clients to understand the larger landscape as a coherent system. So if you start studying a river as opposed to a stretch of the river, you begin to see it as a coherent system. And contour mapping was key to this new understanding. In 1725, just 2 years before Andrea Chiesa began survey work in Perugia, the Dutchman Nicholas Kroek laid down general principles to be followed in the design of river maps in Holland. His basic principle was to create clear maps with uniform scale and a design which contained only the topographic information relevant to the work of the department. For him, it was the Navy. He experimented with depth contours and included profiles and diagrams that portrayed, quote, as accurately as possible the invisible natural processes which influenced the river landscape, unquote. His idea of visualizing planes of water level, i.e. contours, to illustrate contours, which in this case are isobaths, contours of depth. The first example ever done is his 1730 map of Merwede. And this work is crucial for shipping because it describes the contours of the shore so that ships can land and avoid obstacles. His cartographic model for isobaths was followed fairly consistently throughout the 18th century in Holland. And what I don't know is what was happening in Italy at this time. But contour mapping met some general resistance, and it wasn't really accepted until the end of the century. So we take contour mapping for granted, but it really didn't emerge as a descriptive tool until the mid-18th century. At this early stage, it's not clear to me whether Chiesa and Gambarini were familiar with Kroek's work, but aside from military maps of the period, their Tiber River studies present some of the most detailed sectional studies of rivers on the peninsula. These sections offer us a new scientific view of the Tiber, one that parallels other scientific investigations at this time. Their image of Ponte Trionfale, this is the bridge that fell down 1100 years, or in 799. So on the map, it's the Pons Neronianus, essentially. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not showing you right. I actually left my computer at home, so a lot of this is on the fly. Okay, here's Ponte Trionfale, and here's their section through the river. Now this has been narrowed. I don't know quite why they did that, whether it's to accentuate detail or to accentuate the depths, or whether it was a lack of space, but it's a fairly consistent strategy on the maps. What we see in this map is extraordinary, and this is because of their soundings along the river. This image reveals how the two tallest piers, which are left over from the river, were well below the high water mark of the 1742 flood. That's the high water mark. It discloses just how precarious was the Tiber's bed and describes the only acceptable path for boats, which is between those two. That it lies between those two, and that it's also telling us that here there was the footing for a mill, and even though it's really hard to see, one of those Passanate palisades was described on the other side. Here's the Vasi image of the same site, and the section would have been cut, of course, right here. So it's giving us this whole new topography of Rome. Alessandro, let me see. And again, this is the place where all of this debris fell in.